Hello friends. Today, this video, we are going to be talking about the Iraq War, and this video is actually going to correspond to the activity that you have in Google Classroom for Monday and Tuesday of week 5 of remote learning, dealing with our entrance into the Iraq War and evaluating that decision to enter. So let me present here. But we are going to be looking into, as I said, that evaluation of the Iraq War, which is a war that ended about, about 8 years ago at this point. So make sure that while you are filling in the notes, or while you are watching this video, I should say, that you have the notes portion of that assignment pulled up, so that way you can fill in the appropriate blanks as we go. So the first thing that we want to do as we're going through this video is just do some context. You guys know we have to talk about context in order to understand the event at large. So we're going to start with some geography, just getting a look at where Iraq actually is in the Middle East. So here on the left, you can see this is kind of a big blown up picture of the country itself. And we're going to be focusing a lot, you're going to hear this word a lot, of Baghdad. This is the capital of Iraq itself. And as you can see, Iraq is actually surrounded by quite a few big players that we've talked about already in this unit, and a lot of players that you have probably seen featured prominently in the news, right? So you've got Saudi Arabia, which we saw talking about the rise of the Middle East, those religions, especially when it comes to OPEC and oil. Iran has been featured predominantly in the news, Turkey, Syria, right? So it's definitely kind of in the middle of like a hot spot in the Middle East. And it's pretty centrally located. So if you take a look at the world map, the world view, you can see it's pretty centrally located here in the Middle East. That ultimately is going to give it some pretty significant, it's going to be pretty significant, I should say, when it comes to events, and it's very large. It's a pretty large country, okay? So just to give you some context of where we're talking about. So let's go ahead and talk about the conflict itself, looking at just some context and some basics, some key players. And this, sometimes this Iraq War is sometimes referred to as the Second Iraq War. And we are going to be really talking about a couple different people in this conflict here. One of them is Saddam Hussein, which you see down here. Saddam Hussein, our history with this guy actually goes back a little bit longer than our entrance into this war, which you can see started on March 20th, 2003. And then ended in December of 2011. Yeah, so about 8 years ago. But our history with him goes back a little bit further than this, actually back into the 1990s. The United States and a group of countries allied with it actually went to war against Hussein over his efforts to try and expand his influence into the Middle East even further. Because as you can see here, he is or was a dictator of Iraq. And we have a pretty long history, as you've seen in this class, of fighting dictators and wanting to spread democracy. So we actually went and tried to stop him. But what he was doing back in the 90s was trying to use his power, as a lot of dictators often do, to try and gain influence and resources. And like I said, expand his empire, so to speak. This conflict was over within a few months. It was not very long. But something that will come up as we go through this presentation is that when that war conflict was over, the treaty that was signed at the very end between the U.S. and their allies and Saddam Hussein required Saddam Hussein to do certain things that we will see carry over into this conflict, which, as I said, starts in 2003. Okay. So the other key person that we are going to be talking about is President George W. Bush. George W. Bush was the president during the 9/11 attacks, and he is actually going to declare a war on terror after 9/11, which you have seen us talk about already when we talked about Afghanistan last week. But this war on terror is a very large justification for carrying out the invasion of Iraq. Now, something to note at this point, because of 9/11, the U.S. already had troops in Afghanistan. So it was pretty easy for us to kind of just jump on over to Iraq and continue the conflict here. And something to note, guys, I know that, if you were born already at this point, you were not watching TV. But I even remember as a small child, I would have been in, 2003, I would have been in like the 4th grade. I even remember this being insanely publicized on TV. You could literally turn on any news station and you could watch troops roll into Iraq. It was broadcasted live on TV. And our goal was to ultimately remove Saddam Hussein from power, which, as we went to war in the 90s with him or over him, that's kind of what we were trying to do. But this time now with 9/11 happening, we definitely wanted to remove him from power completely. And as you guys saw, we had already started a war on terror in Afghanistan, so it was a pretty easy jump to head into Iraq. So let's talk about the justifications for entering and invading the country. So there are 2 reasons which we will evaluate in the coming lesson about, their legitimacy. But the very first reason is that Bush said that Iraq, which obviously being the dictator was led by Saddam Hussein, was secretly making weapons of mass destruction, or you'll hear them called WMDs. And these WMDs can be nuclear, they can be biological weapons, they can be chemical weapons. And we've actually talked about WMDs before in this class with the Cold War, the arms races that were happening building up those nuclear weapons, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was about nuclear weapons, right? Biological weaponry and chemical weaponry, we've actually talked about in this class too. We've talked about that with Syria, right? With President Bashar al-Assad, who we saw in our dictator project is probably more aligned with a dictator. He has those scoop characteristics, but he uses those chemical and biological weapons on his own people, protesters that don't agree with him. Now, something to note is that part of that peace treaty from the 1990s that I mentioned, when we first went into Iraq and, tried to fight Saddam Hussein and prevent his spread of power, was that Saddam Hussein was not allowed to have WMDs, right? Part of the, okay, we'll back off, but you have to promise that you will not make these weapons of mass destruction that will ultimately threaten democracy. Now, after 9/11, evidence came out that he was supposedly making these weapons of mass destruction secretively. And obviously that would have been considered to be a very large problem for the safety of the world. We didn't want to have a dictator in possession of these types of weapons. The second reason we entered Iraq was that President Bush and his administration also accused Iraq of supporting al-Qaeda, which, as you saw in the lesson on Afghanistan, was the terrorist group that was responsible for carrying out 9/11 under Osama bin Laden. And actually, al-Qaeda was really the reason that we entered into Afghanistan as well, right? The Taliban, which was centered in Afghanistan, supporting al-Qaeda. So we believed that Saddam Hussein was actually providing a refuge, a place of safety for al-Qaeda members. And this was why we felt like we needed to go in and try and get them out of the country and, get revenge essentially on that group for the terrible attacks on 9/11. These two reasons are ultimately what you are going to be evaluating. These are the justifications, and you will be evaluating these justifications when you complete the document analysis of part 2 of this activity, which I have scheduled for Tuesday of week 5 of remote learning. And you guys will be considering whether this decision, based on these two justifications, was based on solid evidence, whether it was justified or unjustified. Okay. Now, at first, when we entered Iraq, things seemed to be going well. When we entered, we very quickly toppled Saddam Hussein. He fled pretty quickly. And as you can see here, this is a pretty famous set of images, actually all 3 of these, but these 2 in particular. This is the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein. Saddam had built statues of himself, as we've seen dictators often do, right, to commemorate his rule. And we were pretty quickly able to topple his government. And, you know, the Iraqi people, as you can see, cheered. He was very oppressive, especially as we will see when it comes to different religious groups. So this was definitely displayed on the news and in the perspective of a lot of Iraqi people positively. And Bush even gave a pretty famous speech saying essentially all is well, the war is over. You can see in the background, mission accomplished, right? We did what we needed to do at first, which was get rid of Saddam Hussein. But there were some miscalculations after those initial efforts. There were definitely some mistakes, as we will see, come out that kind of taint this event. So one thing to note is that the U.S. faced resistance and many challenges in Iraq. Yes, people were happy to see Saddam Hussein removed from power, but just as we've seen, when dictators are removed, that often leads to chaos because now you don't have anyone in government in power. And that leads to a lot of chaos. There was no more leader. And that led to a lot of instability. And because we were not prepared to deal with some of the religious divisions, some of the ethnic divisions in Iraq, and a civil war actually broke out. And this week, we are actually going to be taking a look at the different divisions of Islam, which are the Shiite. I know what you guys are thinking. It's pronounced Shiite, my friends, versus the Sunni Islamic sects. These two groups are both Muslim, yes, but they have very different ideas on how to lead a country, how it should be run. So there are divisions between Islam that when Saddam Hussein gets removed from power actually leads to a lot of competition, disagreement, and civil war. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. So when he was toppled, he had actually oppressed a lot of Shiite Muslims who, when he was gone, wanted control. And this obviously did not go over well with the Sunnis who didn't want to be controlled. So it's going to lead to a lot of tension and conflict there. Ultimately, though, Saddam Hussein, as I've said, was captured, and he was actually executed for war crimes in 2006. He was not imprisoned. He was actually executed for his war crimes, a lot of them being ethnic cleansing of the Shiite minority, and then, just genocidal acts in general. In total, from 2003 to 2011, 4,486 U.S. soldiers lost their lives in Iraq. So it definitely was not without consequence for the years that we were there. Alrighty, so this leads us to our big driving question that you guys will be answering, which is how should we remember President Bush's decision to invade Iraq? This invasion is actually one of the greatest controversies and criticisms of Bush's presidency because of the instability that resulted because of this invasion. Actually, as we will see this week too, the invasion of Iraq can ultimately be a starting point for the terrorist group ISIS as well. So obviously this is highly criticized. Your job which will be the lesson tomorrow. You do not have to do the document analysis today as you're watching these notes. You can put it off until tomorrow. But you guys will be answering this question. And you have 2 documents that you will analyze and evaluate and discuss whether you think the decision to invade Iraq, based on those 2 reasons we talked about, right, weapons of mass destruction and Iraq supporting al-Qaeda, was this decision justified or unjustified? How should we remember this? Was it a good thing or a good decision or a bad decision? Okay, so that is your assignment for the next part of the document. Make sure that you guys are reaching out if you have any questions, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.